You feel it in your bones when the world gets loud. Wars flare up, politicians rage, markets twitch, and everyone pretends it's about oil, territory, security, or morality. But underneath the noise is a simpler, uglier engine: money. Specifically, the right to create money, the right to force everyone else to accept it, and the right to keep pretending that the bill won't come due. Most people won't say this out loud because it makes them complicit. If you admit that geopolitics is a currency cage, then you have to face your own currency cage too. The cage might not be made of tanks and sanctions. It might be made of debt, employment dependence, social status, and the quiet fear of losing your place. This video is about the currency war you can see and the currency war you live in, and how both work the same way: control the flow, control the lives. Here's what we're going to break down. First, how the modern war story is often just a payment story wearing a military uniform. Second, how the United States managed to tie global energy trade to the dollar and why that system behaves like a permanent power plant for printing. Third, why attempts to escape the dollar are treated like existential threats, not policy disagreements. Fourth, how Russia, China, and rising coalitions build parallel systems that don't require permission from Washington. And fifth, what happens when trust collapses, because in the end, everything depends on belief, and belief is fragile. Let's start with the uncomfortable premise. The Venezuela conflict, the Iran escalation, the sudden intensity of enforcement actions, the dramatic headlines about leaders being detained or attacked. These are not primarily military events. They are financial events with explosives attached. Their real target is not a landscape. Their target is the settlement mechanism, the payment rails, the currency in which trade is denominated and cleared. When you understand that, you stop asking silly questions like who wants the oil more or who has the better soldiers. Those questions are distractions people use to avoid the real mechanism. The real question is who gets to decide what payment is valid and who gets punished if they refuse. A currency is not just paper or code. A currency is enforcement. A currency is a promise backed by power. When a government can threaten seizure, sanctions, insurance restrictions, shipping bans, and access to the global financial plumbing, it can force the world to keep using its currency even when everyone knows the risks. That's why currency dominance feels like natural law to people who never had to question it. They assume the system is simply how reality works, but reality is built. It can be rebuilt. And right now, the system is under pressure. Now, look at the number that keeps getting treated like background noise. United States public debt, around $38 trillion. That figure is so absurdly large that it loses emotional meaning for people. They see it like a statistic on a chart and move on. But if you force your mind to understand it, it becomes terrifying. Imagine you're paying rent with a credit card you can't possibly pay off. Not next month, not next year, but indefinitely. Now imagine the credit card company has a monopoly on the machine that processes payments. That monopoly allows the company to extend the line and delay consequences. It also allows the company to export the cost, the interest, the inflation, the hidden tax. Other people pay because the system makes it inconvenient not to. Public debt on that scale becomes less like finance and more like gravity. It shapes every decision, it limits every choice, and it creates a desperation that leaders mask as strategy. Every time a government prints money, it doesn't just create cash, it creates consequences. Those consequences show up later, but they show up. If debt is growing faster than productivity, the gap has to be paid in one of three ways: higher taxes, higher growth, or higher inflation. Higher growth is hard and slow. Higher taxes cause political suicide. Higher inflation is fast and politically survivable until it isn't. So when leaders push for cheap money, when they pressure central bankers to cut rates, they're choosing the inflation path. They might call it stimulus, competitiveness, or job creation. Those words can be true in a narrow sense, but the emotional truth is simpler. They're trying to keep the machine running without touching the brake. A debt machine without brakes accelerates, and the longer you accelerate, the more violent the eventual deceleration becomes. Here's the psychological trick that keeps people calm. They think currency systems are based on virtue. They think the American dollar is stable because it's backed by the best economy, the strongest institutions, the smartest investors. But the stability is not moral, it's coercive. It's built on enforcement, and enforcement is always political. So when a leader like Trump pushes aggressively for lower rates and a more pliant monetary authority, you're not just seeing economic policy differences, You're seeing a conflict about control. Who controls the money and whose interests the money serves? In that conflict, central bank independence is not just a constitutional principle, it's an obstacle to the leader's desired timeline. Independence means the monetary authority can refuse political demands to inflate away pain. That refusal can threaten the debt trajectory. This is why such leaders treat the central bank chair as more than a technocrat. In their mind, the central banker is a gatekeeper. A gatekeeper can deny the oxygen. If you can't breathe, you can't keep the empire functional. And then comes the darker part. If a leader believes the country's survival depends on printing, they will tolerate actions that would normally be unacceptable. They will delegitimize institutions. They will investigate officials. They will posture as defenders of the nation while undermining the very processes that restrain the impulse to inflate. But the real question is not whether a leader is right or wrong. The real question is, what happens to the world when the issuer of the dominant currency needs to print faster than the world needs to absorb? Because there's another side to the coin. The dollar's power relies on global demand. The world holds dollars because dollars are useful. They settle trade. They pay debts. They store value. But that demand isn't eternal, it's conditional. If the world sees the issuer treating currency creation like an unlimited resource, then the world begins to think like a homeowner watching a landlord repeatedly skip maintenance. People don't wait for disaster when they can avoid it. They reposition, they hedge, they diversify. And that diversification is what looks like geopolitics from far away. Up close, it's just rational self-protection. Now we have to talk about what people conveniently skip: the petrodollar system. The idea that the global energy market is priced and settled in dollars didn't happen by accident. It was engineered. After the United States ended the dollar's convertibility to gold in the early 1970s, a new arrangement became necessary to preserve trust and demand. The U.S. then used a combination of strategic promises and leverage. The U.S. sought major oil exporters willing to denominate oil sales in dollars. In exchange, the U.S. offered military support and protection. This is where the phrase "bound to the dollar" stops sounding poetic and starts becoming literal. The world wants energy. Energy exporters want security and access. The dollar becomes the middleman that everyone must participate in, because refusing it breaks trade flows. When the system is stable, it behaves like a self-sustaining engine. The world accumulates dollars. That accumulation finances U.S. deficits. Those deficits keep the American state running and keep the military and political influence projecting. In other words, the U.S. doesn't just have a currency. The U.S. has a distribution network for money creation. It's a pipeline. Now imagine the psychological impact when people realize they are trapped in someone else's pipeline. Trapped people don't respond politely. They respond urgently. They look for exits. That's why attempts to settle oil in other currencies are treated as more than trade policy. They are treated as threat to the lifeline. When Iran removes the dollar from its trade settlement practices, it's not just an economic choice. It's a demonstration effect. It says the cage can be avoided. And demonstrations spread like infections. Russia and China, operating under pressure for years, have learned that relying on a single dominant currency is a vulnerability. They learned that access to the global system can be revoked. They learned that sanctions are not just punishment. They are remote controls. So what do? They build alternatives quietly. They accumulate gold. They increase trade settlements in their own currencies when possible. They explore digital platforms or cross-border payments that reduce the need for U.S. clearance. They also talk about more radical futures, including shared settlement systems and new structures for payment. The coalition people now refer to as BRICS is not a superhero alliance. It's an economic coalition shaped by common resentment. Not everyone loves the same ideology. They don't need to. They just need a shared incentive to reduce dependency on a single coercive system. And then there are the Middle East players. This is where the story becomes genuinely dangerous for U.S. dominance. Because if oil exporters that are traditionally close to the U.S. start entertaining the idea of trading oil outside the dollar, then the petrodollar foundation cracks. Not slowly, suddenly. Because energy pricing in dollars is a coordination problem. When enough actors refuse, the remaining actors face a different reality. Their dollars become less useful. Their risk increases. In coordination games, one defection triggers more defections. It becomes a bandwagon away from the dominant currency, and that triggers panic inside the empire because the empire's debt is enormous. The larger the debt, the more sensitive the system becomes to changes in demand. If the world's willingness to absorb dollar assets decreases, the cost of financing increases. The debt becomes more expensive. The debt machine starts to grind. And grinding machines do not negotiate. So what does the US do when it senses the system is slipping? It acts, not with polite diplomacy, not with subtle messaging, with enforcement. This is where the Venezuela story fits, and it fits brutally well. Western media often frame such actions as morality plays. Democracy, human rights, corruption, drugs, those are real categories, but they are often used like paint. They cover the mechanism so people don't look under the hood. The mechanism is payment rails. Venezuela, according to the narrative here, was willing to accept non-dollar payments, explore alternatives like digital token experiments, and navigate sanctions by trying to reduce dependence on US-controlled financial channels. From Washington's perspective, this is not a policy dispute. It is a refusal to remain in the system, and refusal has to be punished. Otherwise, the system teaches a lesson to everyone else. You can opt out, and the cost of opting out isn't that high. In empire maintenance, the most important target is not the leader, it's the signal. The punishment has to be visible enough to deter others. That's why the actions are dramatic and public. If you want to understand what a sanction is psychologically, think of it as a market-wide fear advertisement. It tells everyone else, you don't just face consequences personally, you create consequences for your trade partners too. Your refusal spreads uncertainty, and uncertainty is what the empire sells order against. So when people ask, why does the US care so much about Venezuela's currency choices? The answer is, because Venezuela is a test case. It is a possible blueprint. And blueprints are how cages become broken. Now, the internal logic of such enforcement is chilling but consistent. The US doesn't need to seize every oil field by force. It needs to make the trade settlement dangerous enough that alternative payment routes become unusable. If you control shipping insurance, access to intermediaries, and the ability of counterparties to move assets, you can create a de facto blacklist without firing a single shot. In that logic, a leader becomes a symbol. Maduro becomes a warning label. It doesn't matter whether he is uniquely evil compared to other leaders. What matters is whether his behavior undermines the system's credibility. And credibility in a currency war is everything. Once credibility breaks, debt becomes a trap. Once debt becomes a trap, printing becomes a desperation tactic. Once printing becomes desperation, trust collapses faster than anyone expects. Which brings us to Iran, and why this is not simply another episode. Iran is a more complex opponent because it has resilience in relationships that go beyond simple resource trade. Iran is described here as having removed the dollar from its commerce for a long time. That long practice matters. It's not a temporary workaround. It's an alternative habit. Habits become infrastructure. Iran also influences a wider region, and it sits at an economic crossroads related to major trade routes. That means its actions are not isolated. When Iran demonstrates survival under pressure, neighboring states ask a dangerous question. If Iran can exist and trade despite sanctions, why are we still kneeling? This creates a psychological contagion, and empires hate psychological contagion more than they hate armies. So enforcement expands. It combines military supply, proxy pressure, and high-visibility attacks that send a message not only to the enemy but to the network around the enemy. In this framing, Israel is positioned as a strategic instrument, not merely as an ally with its own goals, but as a pointed tool used to shape regional behavior. The message, as described, is that Middle East stability depends on compliance with U.S. financial architecture. Peace is conditional. Trade is conditional. The choice is framed as loyalty or chaos. You might think this is just politics, but politics is just psychology with uniforms. Now let's step back and connect this to you, because that's the point of the hidden self channel. If you're paying attention, you've noticed how many people in private life operate like small empires. They use control tactics to maintain their position. A person might keep you dependent on them. They might demand confirmation. They might punish refusal. They might insist that a relationship works only if you accept their currency, your attention, your validation, your time, your emotional labor. They may not call it currency, but it is currency. It's something you value, and they control access to it. When you refuse their terms, their response is dramatic. They threaten consequences. They try to turn your refusal into a public lesson to protect their dominance. That is exactly how empires behave. The methods scale up. The psychology stays the same. In relationships, if you stop giving, the person who built their identity on your giving experiences your withdrawal as an existential threat. They respond with coercion. They respond with guilt campaigns. They respond with surveillance disguised as care. At a national level, surveillance becomes shipping interdictions. It looks different, but the core mechanism is the same. Reduce alternatives, punish refusal, and keep the flow of value one-directional. That's why currency wars and relationship wars rhyme. Now we move into the next layer, the counterattack. Russia and China are not depicted as passive victims of sanctions. They are portrayed as building fortresses against financial coercion. Gold accumulation is one element. Gold is a store of value that doesn't depend on one issuer's political integrity. It can't be frozen by a U.S. executive order in the same way financial accounts can. That doesn't make it perfect, but it changes the power dynamics. Another element is building alternative payment rails. When you're able to transfer value outside U.S.-controlled systems, you reduce the empire's ability to punish. You remove the handle it uses to steer your decisions. This is why digital payment mechanisms and cross-border platforms matter. It's not just technology, it's jurisdiction. It's whether the U.S. can see and block the flow. And if you can't see the flow, you can't easily stop it. Sanctions rely on visibility and on intermediaries. If intermediaries are bypassed, sanctions become less effective. So the horror scenario for the U.S., as described, is that countries build a payment system where trade is settled instantly through alternative channels. If the U.S. cannot monitor or interdict the transactions, then enforcement actions like detention orders and shipping penalties become less decisive. That forces a deeper realization. Once financial coercion loses power, you need other tools, and other tools come with higher costs. Now, listen carefully to what that means. In a currency war, the winner is not the one with the biggest army. The winner is the one with the most durable trust in the value of the currency. Trust is the real battlefield. Everything else is theater or delay. If trust collapses, debt becomes unpayable in real terms. If debt becomes unpayable, political leaders choose inflation or default or restructuring. Each option destroys some part of the system and transfers pain onto the population. That's the part nobody wants to say to you directly. The inflation tax doesn't feel like theft. It feels like economic normal. People say, prices are higher, wages don't keep up, savings shrink. They think it's bad luck. It's not luck. It's policy